Why is anime obsessed with Germany? Attack on Titan, JoJo's, Monster, Evangelion. It doesn't matter the genre. Germany is everywhere. German names, German architecture. Even the most iconic villains carry that unmistakable German aesthetic. But why? What is it about Germany that fascinates Japanese people so much? How far back does this obsession go? And what single historical event no one talks about set it all in motion, changing Japanese culture forever? Our story begins in 1603, when Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, in response to Christianity becoming increasingly popular and to prevent Western influences, ordered Japan to close its borders. With very few exceptions, no one could enter or leave Japan. As a result, distant places like Europe became the stuff of legend, a faraway land that could only be glimpsed through the few goods brought by the handful of Chinese, Korean, and Dutch merchants allowed to trade with Japan. Rumors arrived about the great inventions and discoveries European science was making, things that for the time probably sounded like magic. This began to generate an aura of mysticism around Europe and Japan, not unlike what many Westerners felt about Japan in those days, or even today. But everything that begins must end. And on May 3rd, 1868, due to pressure from the USA, Japan opened to the world. There would be no more restrictions. Everyone could enter and leave Japan. As a result, Japan would realize how those nearly 300 years of isolation had helped create a very unique culture different from the rest of the world, but also how it had left them technologically behind. So quickly after this realization, the government began a process of Westernization. Japan would industrialize. The look of cities would change, clothing, and even how the government operated, all to compete with Western nations. But to achieve this, they first had to understand how these nations functioned and gather all the advances Europe had made during the nearly 300 years Japan was closed to the world. To do this, they sent many scholars to study in Europe, and these brought new knowledge to Japan. The influence is very noticeable, but the most relevant point for this video is that many of the people Japan sent overseas went to Germany. As a result, Japan was shaped in many ways to resemble Germany. For example, the Japanese constitution of the era was literally based on the German one, and as a result, the country began to function similarly to Germany in several aspects. However, this doesn't mean Japan and Germany were besties. In fact, they became enemies when World War I arrived. At one point during the conflict, a group of German soldiers in a part of China occupied by Japan lost a battle and were taken to different prisons in mainland Japan. And something very strange began to happen. In some of these prisons, the prisoners were given greater freedom, even being able to interact with various locals. These locals gradually became more interested in the German soldiers. And long story short, the whole thing ended up with various public events where the soldiers showed German culture to the Japanese. Tens of thousands of people around the country began attending these events. It's even said that Ito Hirobumi, who years later would become the first prime minister of Japan, showed interest in attending these events. Now, it's important to emphasize that this is mostly speculation, but it's very credible and even logical to believe that this greatly influenced the perception of Germany and Japan, as well as facilitating what would come next. During World War II, Japan would become allies with Germany, and here many people think this is where Japan's obsession with Germany began. But this is false. The alliance between Japan and Germany was purely strategic. There wasn't a cultural exchange or anything similar. It's not like the case of Japan and the USA, where you can clearly see how one nation influenced the other. That doesn't exist here, yet. Japan lost World War II. I know, big news. But what may be news to you is the fact that to this day, Japan hasn't apologized and continues to deny various atrocities it committed during World War II. And believe me, it did many horrible things. Anyway, the point is that by denying many of the things it did during World War II, this period isn't taught as it probably should be. I'm not saying Japanese people don't know what happened. Of course they do. Obviously they know. But if you're not properly taught this period of history in school, well, it's no surprise that later you see in anime, video games, or Japanese films characters that are similar to or are German soldiers, or symbols that, although they represent other things, are very reminiscent of imperialist Japan during World War II. What I'm trying to get at is that due to this historical denialism, it was easier for Japan to appreciate Germany and German culture during a period when the rest of the world probably couldn't. Fast forward a few decades. Both Japan and Germany, despite having been devastated by war and their countries literally destroyed, had become economic juggernauts in just a few decades. In Japan's case, it was called the Japanese miracle. In fact, at one point in history, everyone thought Japan would buy all the American companies and become the world's mega power, similar to China today. Here it's important to note how both nations fell together and in a certain way were rising together, which in the eyes of many people created this parallelism between both. Combine this with Japan's historical denialism, and it's easy to see how someone from Japan at the time could admire Germany, saying that both countries are similar and are living through the same thing, which could cause a certain feeling of companionship, if you will. I'm not saying all Japanese people felt that way, but it definitely helped lay the groundwork for what was to come. In the 70s, largely thanks to the economic boom Japan was experiencing, the first anime boom occurred, and something curious was happening. You'd think the most popular anime would be stories by Japanese authors or about Japanese Japanese life. But this wasn't the case. Sure, you had stories like Doraemon that talked about the daily life of Japanese people, but one of the most successful programs of the era was Heidi, Girl of the Alps, which tells the story of Heidi, an orphaned girl who goes to live with her grandfather in the Swiss Alps, where she discovers the beauty of nature, friendship, and the value of kindness. This anime was a worldwide success everywhere: Asia, Europe, Latin America, etc. Except in English-speaking places like the USA. One of the reasons it was so popular was how it showed Europe. It was a place of pastoral landscapes and villages, far away from the pressures of the modern world. It showed Europe as this magical place untouched by time. It was quite whimsical, almost like a fairy tale. Its success is very important, not only because it helped bring anime to the world, but for this video for two following reasons: the television block it belonged to, and who was making the anime. First, the television block. Heidi was the final installment of the Kalpis Comic Theater series, a group of 6 anime based on classic tales from the Western world. Like the Moomins, this television block was a precursor to another immensely popular television block that lasted many decades called World Masterpiece Theater, which focused on stories from European books. Here's speculation. The shift from the West to Europe was probably due to Heidi's great success. Anyway, this television block gave a vision of Europe very similar to what Heidi had. Europe was this far place filled with adventures, wonderful people, and beautiful and dreamy landscapes. For a long time, the World Masterpiece Theater series would be synonymous with anime, and basically all homes would tune in each Sunday to see the new episode of their favorite series. As a result, the vision that many Japanese had about Europe was heavily influenced by how Europe appeared in these anime. Now that's the first reason why Heidi matters in relation to this video's topic, and the second is because of who was making it. In the production were 2 of the most important figures in anime history, Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki, who after seeing Heidi's chaotic production would want to create their own studio called Ghibli, which is the closest thing Japan has to Disney. They made films like the Oscar winner Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, My Neighbor Totoro, and a huge etc. Their films are constantly at #1 at the Japanese box office, and 2 of the things that most often appear in their films are Europe and an anti-war message. For the Europe part, it's the same as with the World Masterpiece Theater: gorgeous architecture and beautiful landscapes. Now for the anti-war message part, it's important to note that Ghibli's founders lived through Japan devastated by World War II, so Takahata and Miyazaki's stories are filled with this message. But the thing is that Japan has this concept called Ba no Kuki wo yomu, which is literally translated as reading the air, but can be best understood as understanding the situation without words, or sensing someone's feelings. Basically, it's a hyper version of reading the room, and is a very important concept for understanding Japanese culture. So as a result of this reading the air thing, many times when making an anime, manga, or Japanese film that criticizes something, many times what's being criticized isn't shown on screen. Instead, it's expected that the reader or viewer will put 2 and 2 together to get the point. So it's partly why in Ghibli films we see this anti-war message shown in stories that happen in Europe, but that are actually in part made to criticize Japan. This isn't something that only happens in Ghibli films. In many anime and shoujo manga of the time, shoujo meaning stories for girls, the settings were frequently European. Not just because most famous fairy tales come from Europe, and many girls like fairy tales, but also because it allowed them to explore themes that might not have been well received by many Japanese people if they had taken place in Japan, such as stories about rainbow people, you know who. We can see this with stories like The Rose of Versailles or The Heart of Thomas, whose creators are part of the so-called Year 24 group, which is a group of shoujo authors who around the same period released several very successful shoujo manga that explored a great variety of deep themes new to shoujo manga, which showed a very idealized version of Europe. As a result of all this, we have things like the phrase Akogare no Paris, which is a Japanese phrase meaning the Paris of our dreams, which refers to the idealized romantic image of Paris that people imagine, full of charming streets, cafes, art, and romance. But rarely is reality as beautiful as fiction, which results in things like Paris syndrome, which is a real condition that happens when tourists, especially from Japan, feel extreme disappointment, anxiety, or stress when they see that Paris doesn't match their idealized expectations. Expectations which very likely were created by all these anime and manga we've been talking about. But okay, that explains the love for France and Europe as a whole, but not Germany specifically. So when did that happen? Well, in 1979, the first Gundam series was released on TV, and it bombed so hard that it actually had fewer episodes than originally planned. However, after the boom of space stories that came after Star Wars, the animation studio made 3 movies re-editing the series, and those were a great success. It's very likely the first anime that existed that was popular with otaku anime fans, since other works like Battleship Yamato were very successful, but the anime fandom didn't exist yet. In fact, Yamato was largely what created the otaku fandom. What I'm getting at is this: Gundam isn't the final reason for Japan's fascination with Germany. We'll see an equally, if not more important point next, but it's important to understand that Gundam was the first flagship anime that the anime fandom had after it existed. Here's what's important. The first Gundam series puts a lot of emphasis emphasis on its villains, and makes you empathize and even feel sorry for them. The thing is, these are clearly based on the German army, possibly in part because of what I mentioned about the Japanese government's historical denialism, and how that affected the perception of Germany in Japan, since something like this wouldn't have happened in the USA or Europe, and also because of the whole reading the air thing I mentioned, as it could have been seen by some as partially a critique of Imperial Japan. And look, I know Yamato's enemies are also based on Germany, but because of what I've already explained about the importance of Gundam, and the fact that Gundam is a much bigger franchise, along with something else we'll get into in a minute, I'd argue that when it comes to this whole Germany thing, Gundam matters more. You might disagree, but that's just my opinion. What's not just my opinion, and is a fact, is that the most popular character in that anime, which, mind you, is part of a universe of interconnected series that's still going today, is Char, the main antagonist of Amuro Ray, the protagonist. This rivalry between Char and Amuro is still going on to this day, with many recent works showing these two characters. But getting back to the point, Gundam being so popular did two things. First, because the villains you're supposed to empathize with, and arguably their most popular character looked like a German soldier, it popularized this German aesthetic. And second, since the series talked a lot about war, suddenly everyone wanted to have their series that talked about the same themes, which gave us a boom in the 80s of series that showed war, which made otaku feel great admiration for war, more specifically weapons, to the point that if you were an anime fan in that era, you basically were also a fan of weapons. That's why in 80s anime, we see so much detail when showing a weapon or a machine. The thing is that due to propaganda of the era that wrongly exalted German weaponry, and the fact that Germany is one of the largest arms producers, and German machinery has this reputation of being the top of the top, a certain fascination was created with their army and their machines. That's why in anime like Evangelion, which is a great critique of anime fans, we have the character Kensuke, who represents these anime fans, telling Shinji things like he wishes he could be him to live with Misato, or pilot a giant robot like the Evas, when part of the story's message is that you shouldn't want that. We see him, without explanation, in uniform and equipped like a soldier, camping when Shinji tries to escape. That scene might seem weird if you don't have the context, but if you read the air, you'll get the full message. The otaku fascination with Germany was also fueled by the rise of 80s RPG games, particularly Wizardry, which would become the foundation for Japanese RPGs. Dungeons & Dragons also played a crucial role when, also in the 80s, a group of Japanese fans created a modified version and published their gaming sessions in a magazine called Comptic. These sessions would become very popular among otakus, and would eventually evolve into the hugely popular and influential Record of Lodoss War franchise, which is still going strong to this day. Both Wizardry and Record of Lodoss War basically became the foundation for all Japanese video games, light novels, manga, and anime dealing with medieval fantasy. From these come the elements we see so clearly marked in these stories, like character classes, guilds, or how elves in anime have those distinctively long ears that contrast with how elves are typically depicted in the West. The European connection here is significant because both Wizardry and D&D drew heavy inspiration from Lord of the Rings, which itself was based on multiple European mythologies and folklore, a lot of which came from Germany. Before going to the next reason for this whole Germany and Japan thing, it's important to know the following. I won't get into why, I've discussed it several times in other videos. You just need to know that in the 90s, Japan was coming from the economic boom of the 80s, but in the 90s, all that ended. Many people lost their money, several others lost their jobs, and many more couldn't find work. Imagine what probably many of you are living through right now, but times 10. This caused a lot of emotional depression in the Japanese public, which is why there are so many depressing anime, films, and video games from that era. Because of this, people were looking for escapist stories that would take them away from their reality, and in the middle of that came Neon Genesis Evangelion, an anime that was so successful that it literally changed what stories were told, how they were told, and how anime was made. It's arguably the most important anime in history, due not only to its impact and popularity, but also because of how it changed anime financing. That is, how anime obtained money to be made. Here's what's important to understand. EVA was the first television anime made to be broadcast during family hours for the general public. That is, people who watched anime like the Masterpiece Theater series, but whose target wasn't that general public. Unlike Gundam, which was originally created for children and only later discovered by otakus, EVA was made for otakus from the very beginning. Because it was so successful, everyone wanted their next Evangelion. This led to changes in the financing model of anime, as well as in what type of stories anime told. By following Evangelion's example, these shows attracted many otaku fans. As time passed, the anime industry began to focus less on the general public and more on what the otaku hyperfans of anime wanted. One of the things most copied from Evangelion was its waifus, that is, the female characters the audience literally fell in love with. The most popular of all these, and of which we still see clones to this day, is who we can arguably call the first real tsundere in history, Asuka, who is half German. This basically made the interest in Germany even bigger, bigger. And as time went on, Germany would become something natural in anime, and creators would put it in their stories without thinking about it.